Okay, all right. Well, it's 6:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. I think we'll probably see more people pop in, but welcome to everybody who's on so far. I'm Katie Fleming. I'm the Community Engagement Director at Friends of the San Juans. Most of the names I see over there are people who I think know who we are, but just in case you don't, Friends of the San Juans is a nonprofit organization with the mission to protect and restore the San Juan Islands in the Salish Sea for people and nature. And of course, the summer is usually the season where we're out and about with our staff and exploring and appreciating the islands with our community. But since we can't do that right now with you in person, we're really excited to partner with Kevin Campion on this talk tonight that will expand our knowledge about the rarest whale on Earth, the North Pacific right whale. So I'm so excited to get to that. But first, just a bit of housekeeping. We're going to use the Q&A function that you'll notice at the bottom of your screen. So we'll use that for questions. Obviously it says Q&A down there. If you have anything you want to ask, type it up as we go on in the presentation, during the presentation. And then at the end, we'll answer questions. So that's how we'll handle that. And then I'm also going to monitor the chat function just in case anybody has any technical questions as we move forward with the presentation today. So write down anything you're having issues with in the chat section, and I'll see if I can help you once Kevin gets going. And we'll get to Kevin shortly. But first, I want to introduce Lovel Pratt, our Marine Protection Program Director at Friends, and she's going to give you some information about an upcoming action alert. So Lovel, I'll bring your presentation up and hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight and for this opportunity to tell you about an upcoming action alert. Yes. And I'll wait for the slide here. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm going to be telling you about the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 expansion project that would be located just north of the US-Canadian border, less than a mile from Washington State. This aerial photo zooms into the project location in the Fraser River Delta. You can see the existing West Shore Coal Terminal, the largest coal terminal in North America, and the Delta Port Container Terminal adjacent to that. You can also see the Swasin, BC Ferry Terminal, an extension of Highway 17, and the US-Canadian border is that horizontal line near the bottom of the slide. So this drawing shows the addition of Roberts Bank Terminal 2. If the project is approved, it would be built on 437 acres of critical habitat for southern resident orcas, salmon, and migratory birds. The Fraser River Delta is globally significant as a crucial stopover for birds on their migration routes. Just one example is that nearly all of the world's population of Western sandpipers stop to rest and feed in the Fraser River Delta during their massive migrations between Alaska nesting grounds and wintering sites from California to Peru. So this project, if it gets built, would generate an additional 468 to 520 container ship transits per year. So the environmental review of the project application was recently completed. And I've included just a few statements from the final report on this slide. So in spite of the project impacts to some of the largest salmon runs in the world, and in spite of the impacts to the critically endangered southern resident orcas, and in spite of the risk of accidents and oil spills from the container ships that carry from 1.5 million to 4.5 million gallons of propulsion fuel, in spite of all these and more project impacts, the Canadian Federal Review Panel is recommending approval of this project. So the next step in the permit decision-making process is Canada's Minister of Environment and Climate Change, who's expected to make a decision regarding approval of the project late in 2020. So in the next 2 weeks, we'll be reaching out to you by email with an action alert and through other social media. And we'll be giving you information about contacting the decision makers in Canada and asking our governor to oppose this project and speak up on behalf of all of us here in Washington State that would be impacted by this project and the project's vessel traffic. And also asking the governor that if Canada's going to approve this project, to ask for additional mitigations. And I want you to know that your voices make a difference. So just yesterday, Zurich Insurance announced that it will no longer provide insurance coverage for the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And this is huge. And you may recall that last August, we reached out to you with an action alert, and many of you contacted Zurich asking that they not provide coverage for the Alberta tar sands Trans Mountain Pipeline. And they listened. So thank you for speaking up then. And I hope you'll speak up again about Roberts Bank Terminal 2. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So once again, I will get you to Kevin here soon. And thank you so much, Lovel. Yeah, that's great. And if any of you are not on the Friends email action alert list, in just a minute, I'll put a link to sign up for our email list, basically, that'll give you action alerts and other news items from Friends. I'll put that in the chat function. So if you are not on our email list and if you want to join in so you can get action alerts like the one Lovel will be sending out soon, you can just click on that link and sign up. It's in the dialogue bubble, which you'll see in the bottom of your Zoom screen here. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it over to Jess Newley, our Marine Program Assistant, and she will introduce her good friend, Kevin Campion.
Thank you, Katie. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We all wish we could be in person, but this is the next best thing, so it's pretty exciting. So my name is Jess, and like Katie said, I'm the Marine Program Assistant for Friends, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight. Kevin Campion, founder of Deep Green Wilderness and captain of the 86-year-old Orion, is a lifelong resident of the Pacific Northwest. Kevin Campion believes strongly in voyaging to capture the imagination and engage with the environment. Kevin holds his 200-ton master's license from the U.S. Coast Guard and has sailed 5 of the 7 seas. With Deep Green Wilderness, Kevin has combined his love of sailing with his passion for teaching ecology and conservation. Kevin enjoys introducing people to the wealth of diversity you encounter when you leave the docks, and hopes his work with Deep Green Wilderness will promote responsible stewardship of our public lands and waterways. A passionate advocate for whales and ocean conservation, Kevin has produced the award-winning film, The Unknown Sea, which my husband and I were lucky enough to be a part of that team, and is currently producing Right Over the Edge to tell the story of the North Pacific right whale, which we're gonna hear about tonight. Okay, so I had to get the important stuff out of the way. Now I get to embarrass Kevin a little bit. So I also had the pleasure of working with Kevin as a lead educator on board that sailboat Orion, which I should mention is one of the most beautiful wooden sailboats out there. That's actually her, anchored off of Yellow Island in the springtime. And yeah, now 8 years later, we're still holding our friendship strong, and we're share duties on the board of director for the Sea Dock Society and continue our adventures above and below the surface. A little more about Kevin, Captain Kevin and his ways. Literally no one can make kids or even myself excited about a shearwater or even a cormorant for that matter, cormorant. His love for waterfowl runs really deep, if you know Kevin. Someone online today described Kevin really in the best way that I've ever heard, which was through the Campion paradox, being impossibly cool and unfathomably dorky simultaneously. He really is like a 40-year-old biologist trapped in like a pumped up teenager's body and spirit most of the time. And whether you meet him at the skate park, on the docks of Shilshol and Ballard, or maybe on the surf in Costa Rica, there are definitely 3 things I guarantee you'll find on Kevin. One is a pair of binoculars around his neck, a smile on his face, and passion and adventure in his heart. It really was the time that I had on board with the Orion. We were sailing around the San Juan Islands and teaching kids about all the fun things like underwater seamounts and bulk help qualities while watching the Southern residents swim their pod past us. So during all of this, I too was falling in love with this special place, and which is why 5 years later, after having my own sailing adventure across the Pacific Ocean, I returned to the islands, and I'm back here working alongside Katie and Lovel for Friends of the San Juans. And I'm trying to do the same thing as I learned from him, which is inspiring Salish Sea stewards through science and education, and then using policy to enact real change in the Salish Sea. So thank you for that, Kevin. And with that, it's your turn. So here's the man himself, Captain Kevin Campion.
Well, that was more embarrassing than it could have been, and less embarrassing than it could have been. So thanks. It's an honor to be here tonight. It's pretty funny to like hang out with my friends in this fashion. And speaking of hanging out with friends, I just got a bunch of texts from all sorts of friends from all over. So hi, J-Mac, and hi, E-Rob, who's watching from England, and it must be terribly late or early or something over there. I just need a hot sec to get my PowerPoint up and my notes up as well. So let me do this and this. Okay, just bear with me one moment here. If anyone has a clever way to do a PowerPoint in presenter view over Zoom, let me know afterwards, because that would be awesome. Because right now I'm clamping an iPad to my computer screen, which has my notes. Okay, we'll see how that works. So, North Pacific right whales, why now is the time to care about the world's rarest whale. So I'm going to talk a little bit about North Pacific right whales tonight. I'll give you guys kind of the Reader's Digest version of their tragic history, and then share with you a little bit about like my personal journey with them and this film that I'm making with a couple of friends. Hi, Shaughnessy, Leon, and hi, T-Rex, who I'm making the film with. First, I just want to give a big thank you to Lovel and Katie and Jess and the crew at Friends of San Juans. These guys are doing amazing work saving this place we love. The Salish Sea is unique in the world, and it takes stewardship every day from groups like them to keep it that way. And this Roberts Bank terminal is a great example. You know, the old adage in the environmental community that our opponents just have to win once, and we have to win every time. You know that if they build this bank, if the Kinder Morgan pipeline gets completed, that means really bad things, and it's hard to undo that. So Friends is out there every day doing the good work to prevent these things from becoming real in the Salish Sea. So thank you. And thanks to all of you who are tuned in on your computers tonight. Summer evenings in the Pacific Northwest is so precious. And so thank you for sacrificing one of those to learn about the world's rarest whale. So with that, get my workflow here following my notes and my PowerPoint. So Deep Green Wilderness is a boat-based organization. Jess and I work together on the boat. On a good year, we take teenagers out voyaging for a week up to 3 weeks, learning about whale conservation, sailing, navigation. Our mission at Deep Green Wilderness is to help the sea create change that is meaningful to the ecosystem, the community, and the future. And I think we do that when we're out there. But our informal mission is creating ambassadors for the Northwest Coast, one whale at a time. And we're not, of course, turning the whales into ambassadors. We're turning our students into ambassadors when they get to see whales. So and when we're not doing sailing programs, we get to do this filmmaking, and that is how I got into this journey of kind of becoming an advocate for North Pacific right whales. And don't forget, there'll be a Q&A at the end. So I think if you have questions, you can type them into the comments. I think whenever you have them, and then we'll be able to see them at the end. I'll start by saying I am not an expert about North Pacific right whales. And although Brian in this picture, he would say the same. He would say he's not an expert. He is exponentially more expert than I am about North Pacific right whales. I would not know about North Pacific right whales or not for Brian. He's one of the saltiest people on the planet. I would say he spent more time at sea alone looking for whales than probably just about anyone else. Here's a picture of a track lines of surveys he ran in 1 year of working for a Department of Fishery and Oceans. This is the entrance to the Straits of Juan de Fuca. So this is Cape Flattery here, Nia Bay. This is Vancouver Island. So just to give you some scale and context of where that is. And if you look at where all these lines cross, this is a place called Swiftsure Bank. And it was at Swiftsure Bank in 2013 when Brian saw this. And then this in the group of humpback whales that he was surveying at the time. And what Brian recognized after a little bit of sleuthing is that he was looking at a North Pacific right whale. Brian watched that whale in BC and then watched that whale swim south into Washington State. And when it did that, that's when I found out about North Pacific right whales for the first time in my life. So that's 2013, not very long ago. I've been a whale nerd for 42 years now. So I was shocked to find out that there was this large species of whale that had flown under my radar for so long. Until 2013, this was the last right whale seen in British Columbia. This was a whale in 1951 that was killed by whalers at the north end of Vancouver Island, or from the north end of Vancouver Island. It was killed about 250 miles northwest of Seattle. Then as now, it was illegal to kill North Pacific right whales because then as now, they were critically endangered. And in a minute, I'm going to take a deep dive into whaling and humans' kind of tragic relationship with right whales. And I would say that just about anywhere humans have interacted with whales, it sort of ended tragically for the whales. And you examine this history and it's kind of dark and sad, but I also like to, as I'm looking at the history of right whales or any large whale populations, it's really cool to also see the resiliency of these whales as individuals and of populations where, you know, they've had 2 centuries of people doing horrid things to them and they're still here, you know, North Pacific right whales. So as I read about all this whaling and all these numbers of whales killed, I want you to take away that humans have a responsibility to care for these guys because the predicament they are in is entirely our fault. However, I also want you to take away that there's this resilience in these whales individually and collectively that is really cool and inspiring for conservation. But what is a North Pacific right whale? Well, that's a good question. So North Pacific right whale is a large baleen whale. And I'm gonna go to the book, Right Whales, to read you a little bit about right whales in general. This book was written by a guy named Phil Clapham, and I introduced Phil one time as saying, well, Phil wrote the book about right whales, and he corrected me and said, no, Kevin, I wrote a book about right whales. Apparently there's some other ones out there, but Phil has to say, anyone seeing a right whale for the first time could be forgiven for entertaining uncharitable thoughts about the animal's appearance. By any measure, they are odd-looking beasts, robust in form, some would say fat, with a very broad black back, no dorsal fin, and a huge head that is covered with strange horny growths called callosities. The tail, however, the tail is magnificent, a great black triangle that is usually raised high in the air whenever the animal dives deeply. So all right whales are baleen whales. They have 2 blowholes, which you can kind of see in this picture. North Pacific right whales are separate from the 2 other species of right whale worldwide, which are the southern right whales that live exclusively in the southern hemisphere, and then the North Atlantic right whales, which live, of course, in the North Atlantic. The North Atlantic are sort of the famous ones in the conservation movement. They get a lot of coverage, rightfully so, also critically endangered. But they kind of hog the spotlight for us that work on North Pacific right whales. So there's 3 species of right whale, North Pacific living, of course, in the North Pacific. Being baleen whales, it means that they have baleen. They have up to 220 to 260 pleats of baleen on either side of their mouth. And this basically is a just intense killing machine if you look like this. So this is a copepod. These guys are about the size of a grain of rice, but they can occur in such abundance that it makes sense for one of the biggest animals in the world to build its mass by eating these copepods. And abundance barely even describes it. These guys can occur up to 20 million individuals, rice-sized individuals, in a cubic meter. So that's a lot of lipids, that's a lot of fat for the whales to be eating. It turns out if you want to be an enormous animal on the planet, it makes sense to feed on plankton. So North Pacific right whales, like I mentioned, live in the North Pacific. Here is a map of their range as we know it. This isn't necessarily a map of their range today, but this is a map of data collected from the last 200 years, mostly from whaling, mostly from whales killed and where those whales were killed and when. So basically North Pacific on our coast, from the Bering Sea down to Baja California, and that is considered the Eastern Pacific population. And then there's a population on the Western Pacific that is from the northern Russia, also in the Bering Sea side, all the way down to off the coast of Japan and Korea. So we know some about North Pacific right whales, but we don't know a lot about North Pacific right whales. And the reason we don't know a lot about North Pacific right whales is because we hardly ever see them. Researchers will go years without seeing right whales. And most of the right whales that get seen now are in this little chunk of federally designated critical habitat that's in the Southeast Bering Sea. So on this graphic here, all those marks, you can see they're from different years and different IDs. All those marks represent sightings, but that's almost the bulk of the sightings from the last 20 years of right whale research. Researchers go years without seeing right whales. The reason right whales are so rare is because people have been killing them for the last 200 years. And so the coast of Washington and the coast of British Columbia were the cultural epicenters of indigenous whaling, one of the epicenters of the world. There's a very deep and whaling culture that happened in this place, and a really deep and intense connection to whales themselves from the people that lived on our outer coast and on the outer coast of Vancouver Island. It's a living, very much, it's not even living history, it's a living thing. These people still hold whaling dear and still do that from time to time, as everyone probably knows. If you guys are interested in it, this is I'll go back one. This is a beach off of Vancouver Island where the whales were hauled ashore to be butchered by the Nuu-chah-nulth people. And here's that same beach today. So it is very much a part of what happens out there still. If you guys are interested in this, there's a super cool book called Spirits of Our Whaling Ancestors by Charlotte Cote. I highly recommend reading it. It's really cool. And of course, the indigenous whaling was not detrimental to any of these whale populations. Humpback whales, gray whales, and also right whales were taken by these folks. But it was really commercial whaling and the advent of commercial whaling in the North Pacific that started decimating right whale populations. Following the commercial extinction of sperm whales and right whales in the Atlantic Ocean, commercial whalers started entering the Pacific and then on into the North Pacific. In 1835, was the first year that there was really a solid commercial whaling presence in the North Pacific. And what they found in numbers of right whales was astonishing to them. And the news and the word quickly got out to the point that this is what the North Pacific looked like. It started in about 1840. And whale oil was used for a lot of the things that we use oil for today, machinery and lubricants and all that. And it was also used for lighting. And much of the Northeast burned whale oil to light the cities and light their lamps. And it was a very lucrative commodity. And so lucrative that over the course of 10 years, between 1840 and 1850, over the course of that 10 years, some 20 to 30,000 individual right whales got shipped to the east coast of North America in the hulls of these whaling ships. That number is it's just insane to me that 10 years, wooden ships, sailboats, a sailing-based whaling industry could kill 30,000 individual right whales. But those numbers that we think are pretty accurate. A number of people have done research on this and looked into the old logbooks, the whaling records, and it's astonishing, but it's true. And so it turns out that by the end of the 19th century, right whales were commercially extinct in the North Pacific. And so they were no longer targeted by about 1870. Obviously they were taken if they were found, but no one ever found them, and so they weren't taken. And they started to recover a very little bit as a population, we think. And it also was kind of horrible timing in that their first little bit of recovery coincided with the advent of modern industrial whaling. And so if you look at this ship here, it's much different than those sailing boats that were taking whales in the 1840s and 1850s. Steam power, diesel power, let all sorts of different new, faster species of whale, or they weren't new species of whale, they were new to be targeted. It let these whales get targeted by the whaling industry. And it was sort of a second gold rush in whaling. Interesting to me as a Seattleite and a Washington native is Washington State's connection to that whaling industry. You guys, as I'm guessing there's some people watching from the San Juan Islands, I'm hoping there are, and you will recognize the name Moran, of course. This is the ship Moran. It was a whaling ship built in of course, the Moran shipyards, the same Moran that the park on Orcas Island is named after. And the Moran and her sister ships went to the whaling industry in Alaska that started in about 1900 and went into the 30s. And that Alaska whaling industry was the most destructive at this time to right whales. This pier here, I'll take it back, that the like promo shot for me for this talk, we are standing on a pier that extended from this platform in this picture. But you know, we had photography at this point, and so you can see the whales are taking. This picture is crazy if you could see exactly how big that whale is. So it fills the description of fat. These whales were robust for sure, and you can see why they were targeted. And so that industry went on, you know, kind of in fits and starts. It actually that era of whaling really ended in 1967 when Cole Harbor closed in the north end of Vancouver Island. But while that was going on, the tail end of that era of whaling, the Soviets were also launching these sort of modern factory fleets that were going all around the world. And the interesting thing about right whales and North Pacific right whales included is that they were protected in 1935, and they were actually, it's one of the first worldwide treaties to protect the marine mammals. The fur seals were the only ones before that. And North Pacific, or right whales and gray whales in 1935 were the first whales to ever be protected by a law. Now, it was like a treaty, and so the Soviets were signatory to that. However, they did not follow it, and illegal Soviet whaling in between the 40s and the 60s killed another like 681 right whales, we think, looking at those. So that was, again, the population was starting to come back. Again, it got knocked down in the North Pacific. And of course, human interactions are still going on to be causes of mortality for right whales. What we know about human-caused mortality in right whales comes almost exclusively from research on North Atlantic right whales. North Atlantic right whales are, because they occur on our East Coast where you have lots of people and researchers, we know it when a right whale dies. Often it washes ashore, or a fisherman runs into it or something. And so we know that entanglement in fishing gear, you can see this whale is entangled in very likely lobster gear. Here's this graphic of how it works. Entanglement in fishing gear and ship strike is the leading cause of mortality for North Atlantic right whales. Now, of course, where North Atlantic right whales occur, there's more ships and there's more fishery, but that doesn't mean that our North Pacific right whales aren't encountering fishing gear and aren't in danger of ship strike. There are, the parts of the Bering Sea are heavily fished in a crab fishery and a handful of other fisheries. And then places where these right whales occur, certainly Swisher Bank, and I'll get into this a little more, they're very exposed to shipping traffic. Advance my notes here. And so typically North Pacific right whale research is focused in this little chunk of critical habitat that they have in the Southeast Bering Sea. And we do know, what we know about North Pacific right whales is based mostly on acoustic data that has been collected, and they've been found through acoustics. That's often how researchers find them. Much like if you guys ever tune into the hydrophone at Limekiln, or if experienced the southern residents through the hydrophones, that is how we learn a lot about North Pacific right whales. And that's how right whales are often found. And no one is better at finding right whales with acoustics than Jess Krantz here. She's like the preeminent North Pacific right whale acoustics lady. She's pretty badass for a number of reasons, not the least of which is how good she is at finding right whales with acoustics. So Jess, on a normal year, spends months at sea listening for right whales. This is a picture of a research boat she was out on last summer, was intended to be out on this summer to go out and listen for right whales. What they do is they go out and they deploy hydrophones over the side like this. The hydrophones communicate via satellite back to the ship, so they can, if they have a few of these out, they can triangulate where they're hearing a whale and then go on to find the whale. And if they get a recording, I hope you guys can hear this. This is what the right whale sounds like. The last time I did that presentation, that audience was not able to hear that. So I hope you're able to. It's what's called a gunshot call. If you didn't hear it, you can imagine from its name what it sounds like. And so lots of Jess's work has been focused in this critical habitat area in the Southeast Bering Sea. Most of those little symbols on that area identify a whale that was first heard by Jess or her team or some of her colleagues, and then found after they heard it first. And if you look right in the center, there's this kind of clump right there. And right in the center of that clump is a fixed hydrophone on this buoy named Peggy. And now Peggy is one of the only hydrophones in the world that regularly records, I would say it is the only hydrophone in the world that regularly gets calls of North Pacific right whales sometimes. So part of the year that is, and that's in our summer months. So like right now, basically is kind of the peak of when Peggy should be getting North Pacific right whale calls. Noah leaves Peggy in for the summertime and the non-ice months, and then they'll go pick her up in September or October, depending on when they think the ice is going to come in. Knowing about Peggy, knowing about we're making this film about right whales, I'll kind of go in reverse order, the expeditions we've done to go film them. But last summer, I had the insanely good luck to get to go out and voyage to Peggy. Here I am on the third morning underway when we pulled up to Peggy. It was, we've been talking about Peggy for months in this sort of like half jokingly, half mystical way of like, we get to journey to Peggy. And our arrival at Peggy could not have been any more perfect. It was like the sun rising behind the buoy and you could see it far off, and it was like glass calm on the Bering Sea. And we were absolutely like bubbling over with anticipation to, at the very least, hear a right whale that day through our own hydrophone, and at the best, of course, find a North Pacific right whale that day. That day, we did not neither hear or find a North Pacific right whale, but it did mean that we got to be out in the Bering Sea for 2 weeks underway in their critical habitat, looking for them and just experiencing this place. About 4 days into the expedition in the Bering Sea, or like maybe 2 days in, we remembered to turn the chart plotter on, and 4 days in, we had on the chart plotter accidentally traced a whale tail into the middle of their critical habitat. I'd like to say we did that on purpose, but we didn't. So being underway, like looking for this insanely rare whale with your best friends is like I can't describe how cool it is and how much it's meant to me to get to go on this journey on the Bering Sea. And then the other expedition we did was around Vancouver Island. And the things you see, Jess mentioned, I'm into birds. I have a particular knack for getting students excited about birds, which I do. I get excited about birds and I share it with my students. Here's an albatross. The things we get to see offshore are things you don't get to see in the San Juans and you don't get to see from shore. Mola mola. We did a lot of searching out there. We get, going around Vancouver Island, we got to see the northern resident killer whales. It's just like this insane experience that you wouldn't know about, wouldn't get to have if you didn't go out and go looking. The people I got to meet, this guy's name is Harry Hull. Harry was a whaler at the Cole Harbor whaling station, and getting to sit down and talk to this guy and hear about what life was like at the whaling station, what life was like on the whaling boats, was super interested in this. He wouldn't tell you he's a conservationist, but this guy feels very strongly about the wild places he lives, and like hearing how his interactions with whales when he worked in the whaling industry and how he just conceptualizes the world he lives in. It's super informative to my sort of view back into history and what the work these guys did. Joey Elstein, this guy, he runs the Cole Harbor Whaling Museum. He's like this insanely famous seaplane pilot. If you're in the seaplane pilot community, I guess. I'm not, but I learned that later on. But just getting to meet these people, getting to go to sea with folks, seeing all the whales that we did get to see, just, I mean, I can't describe it. It's cool. If you ever have the chance to go do anything like this, go do it. There's some more pics of my friends. E-Rob is watching from England right now. Shaughnessy's birthday. Shaughnessy's watching from Oakland right now. Super cool experience. Like I said, this is Carl catching us cod for dinner up in the Bering Sea. This is Ollie preparing us a strudel for dinner. Life on the Bering Sea is actually on a sailboat much chiller than you would think it is, or at least that was our experience. I think I showed this pic already, and then the 2 weeks are over and you're back in Dutch Harbor and it looks like this, and the moon is rising, the sun is just set, and it is like 11:30 at night. So although outside the Bering Sea, sightings of North Pacific right whales remain extremely rare and have since the early 20th century, sightings do occur. And with the sightings that occur both within and outside the Bering Sea, researchers are able to do sort of mark recapture math. They recognize these right whales the same way that researchers photo ID southern resident killer whales. Researchers are able to photo ID right whales. So if you look at like the callosity patterns, this is Pisces here. If you look at these patterns of these things called callosities on the right whales, those are unique on every right whale, on every individual, just like the saddle patch and the dorsal fin is on resident killer whales or on all killer whales. And so doing mark recapture with these sightings, both within the Bering Sea, out of the Bering Sea, on both sides of the Pacific, the researchers think that on our side, on the East Pacific, so off the North American coast, that we have about 30 individual right whales left. So 30 whales is not a viable whale population. It is insanely low. When the term critically endangered gets applied to this population, that word critically should be bold and underlined and everything else, because these guys are at an insanely low level, solely caused by humans' interactions, whaling of this population. On the Russian side, on the Western Pacific, the less is known about those whales. They do turn up from time to time, and we think there's less than 300 whales over there. So if you look at the whole population in the North Pacific, and those two populations, I should say, the Western population and the Eastern population, there's not a lot of genetic exchange between those two populations. So they're considered as two separate, although they're the same species, they're sort of two separate populations, much like resident killer whales, southern resident killer whales are considered separate from northern resident killer whales. So collectively, those two populations have about 300 or less whales in it. Our population in North America that we as Americans and Canadians are responsible for, there's about 30 whales left. So, and over the past, like I said, most of those sightings are in the Bering Sea, and that is in part due to the fact that most of the effort looking for right whales is also in their critical habitat in the Bering Sea. And it is due also in part to the fact that they do use that habitat in the summer. It is where their critical habitat is in the Bering Sea is in fact critical habitat for them. They use the oceanographic conditions there, create these blooms and densities of plankton that it is a key feeding spot for them. But, and this I think is important to why now is an interesting time or a crucial time to start caring about North Pacific right whales. But they do turn up outside the Bering Sea. And when they turn up outside the Bering Sea, some things are noteworthy about that. One, that it's only every few years, often only every few years. But when they are found, they're usually new to the scientific catalog. So like Center for Whale Research keeps a catalog. Again, I'll use the resident killer whales. They're a great example for some of this stuff. Like Center for Whale Research keeps that resident whale catalog of the individuals. NOAA keeps a catalog of all the individual North Pacific right whales. And when one turns up outside of the Bering Sea, for the last decade, whenever they've turned up, it's always been a new individual that science has never seen before. And in the last like 30 years or something, it's often a new individual. One of the things I did not mention earlier on is that one of the, in regards to how little we know about these guys, is that we know where they go in the summer, the Bering Sea, and they much like humpbacks and gray whales migrate north in the summer months. That right whales also migrate north, we know, in the summer months. We know that primarily from historic whaling data. You know, those long days of sunlight really like kick the the food web into overdrive and plankton production and all that. So there's a reason everyone goes up north for the summer months. But what we don't know, and the whaling data doesn't really show this, is where North Pacific right whales go in the non-summer months, in the months that other right whale populations go to breed and calve. And we know where southern right whales go. We know where North Atlantic right whales go. We don't know half the year where North Pacific right whales go. And we don't know where they go to breed and calve, which, if you're trying to conserve the species, I would argue is very critical data to get about this species. So the fact that we don't know that is one, I think it's really cool that there's like this mystery in the ocean. And when I'm talking to students and young people about ocean conservation, the fact that one of the largest animals ever to exist in the world, largest blue whales ever, about 110 tons, which is the largest animal ever. Largest North Pacific right whale is right in a little over 100 tons. So kind of the second massive animal that's ever lived in the world. We don't know where they go. It's crazy. So there's this like cool mystery if you want to learn about, get into ocean conservation. But there's also this like tragedy in that as Americans, with these guys listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act, we have a legal obligation, and I would argue a moral obligation, to do every single thing we can to conserve them. And not knowing these critical facts about them mean we cannot do everything we are able to do to conserve them. So we don't know where, if these guys, when they're going to calf, if they're having interactions with fishing gear, if they're having interactions with shipping, if there's a toxic algal bloom where they are, like all these things, we just don't know. So this next few slides, I'm just going to show you guys some of the sightings outside of the Bering Sea that have happened in the last 10 years. And when I was mentioning at the beginning how it's the resilience of this whale population and how they're still here after we've just been doing, having all these negative interactions with them, it's really cool to see that in the last 10 years, on average, there's been a right whale seen every other year, which is extremely rare, but it is actually represents an increase in right whale sightings off our coast. And each of those whales have been individuals, which is really cool. And then collectively, if you look at all these sightings from the last 20 years, I think it shows where researchers should start looking for critical habitat, and where, even more importantly, where policymakers and managers should start considering designating critical habitat and considering right whale interactions with human activity. So if you start in 96, there was a right whale seen off Baja, California. Also in 96, there was a right whale seen off Hawaii, which is the only record I've ever seen off one off Hawaii. 98, coast of California. 2013, this was the first one seen in BC since that one was killed in 1951. And then next comes my favorite whale, the one Brian Gisborne found off Swiftsure Bank. Then 2015, 2 were seen off the coast of California. 2017, another 2 were seen off the coast of California. California, Baja, California, and the coast of California really match what the calving habitat looks like on the East Coast. The right whales on the East Coast go to Florida, South Carolina, Georgia to calve, shallower, warmer water, not like tropically warm, but warmer, where there's less transient killer whales, there's less storms, where a baby whale, a juvenile whale, has a good chance of like putting on mass before it has to tangle with these real kind of strenuous conditions. So that seeing this clump of whales off of Southern California, off of Baja, that gives me an indicator or indication that would be an interesting place to start looking for these calving grounds and breeding grounds. 2 in 2018 off of Haida Gwaii, those were in the spring. Both those whales were feeding and mild, kind of trending north. And then, like, excitingly is this May, one turned up off the coast of Vancouver Island. And interesting to me is that one was seen by a guy who was working on a commercial ship, shipping stuff up to Alaska. And he knew that it was a right whale and knew that it was a unique sighting to report it, which is one of the reasons why I like getting out and doing these talks, because that somehow he found out about that, and then this like adds a very critical data point to what we know about North Pacific right whales, is that sighting he had. But back to this right whale in 2013 and why I'm excited to talk to people in Washington State and maybe even in British Columbia. So that whale was in a place, or above a place we call Swiftsure Bank. So if you look, this is Swiftsure Bank right in here. Swiftsure Bank is interesting in that it is, a chunk of it is claimed by both Canada and the US. Brian Gisborne, who found this whale at Swiftsure Bank, refers to this area, here's another view of it, refers to this area as the cattle catcher. Not because it catches cattle and not because of anything it does with whales, but because of the shape of the bank itself. When it meets the current that goes in and out of the Straits of Juan de Fuca, it creates so much upwelling and such a rich ecosystem that it is a very crucial place for many critters, including humpback whales and bird species, albatross, fulmars, shearwaters, all these cool birds out there. We know kind of recently exactly how much the southern resident killer whales are using that place as well. Like it's very critical habitat for all these species. There's a handful of endangered humpbacks. There's the non-endangered ones that use this area. And then there's also, we think, some of the endangered individuals that use this area. And noteworthy to me in this picture is, if you look at this, where Swiftsure Bank is, this purple line right here, if there's, I'm sure some sailors out there watching, this purple line represents the shipping lane. And the shipping lane, basically, this is coming into, in the US side, into, of course, the refineries at Cherry Point and Anacortes, but also Port of Seattle and Port of Tacoma. Also, the vessels going into Port of Vancouver also use these same shipping lanes. And like I said, that we know North Atlantic right whales, that ship strike is on any given year a leading cause of mortality for that population. They swim at the surface, they are slow, they don't really react to ship noise by getting out of the way of it, we think. And so these whales get hit by ships. And now if North Pacific right whales, one of those 30, two of those 30, however many are using Swiftsure Bank, I would argue that they are in intense risk of ship strike and collision with a ship. That one that Brian saw swam right through here. And just to like, there's a funny video here I have, we'll see if it plays and you can hear it, from our time at Swiftsure Bank. When we were out there looking for right whales, we encountered the most whales I've ever seen in one place in my life. And we saw hundreds of humpback whales. This was the beginning of October, a couple years ago, hundreds of humpback whales using this place, feeding and interacting with each other. And this was like in Washington State. This is right up the street from the San Juans. It was like one of the most rich wildlife experiences I've ever had. And while we were watching those whales, we would periodically have to drive out of the shipping lanes because a big ship would be coming through, and we didn't see them hit any of the whales, but we certainly saw them go through all the whales. And so, anyways, let me give you a sense of just how many whales are out there.
Hey, Rob, what's it smell like right here?
Whales. Smells bad. Smells like
Where
whales.
are we?
We're at Swiftsure Bank. We
Yep.
just saw like 300 whales. 300 humpbacks.
Oh, so E-Rob right there, hopefully you could hear it, but she was talking about how badly it smelled on the boat from all the whales. So you could smell the whales very intensely. If you've ever smelled a whale, you know it's rough. If you've ever smelled 300 whales, you know it's very rough. But like I mentioned, just very critical habitat out here. And that is why, like, the work that Friends of San Juans is doing is also critical to North Pacific right whales, because things like Roberts Bank Terminal, things like the Kinder Morgan pipeline are going to increase shipping over the Swiftsure Bank area. I don't need to tell you what would happen if there was an oil spill. It would, of course, be tragic for everything, including North Pacific right whales. And so I'm in my presentation's about over. Let's see how much time I have. I'm gonna show you guys a couple videos that are some of the footage we got from our expeditions, and then we'll open it up to questions. And I just have a couple of takeaways that I'd like to leave you guys with. So one thing to consider with these guys, that the extraliminal sightings, those sightings of North Pacific right whales outside the Bering Sea, are new individuals, which means that to me, I take hope in that. Like, when I think about a population of 30 individuals, it seems like they're doomed. But the fact that we keep seeing new individual whales, and the fact that every now and then one of those whales is a juvenile, really cool, and I take hope from that. The recent sightings of North Pacific right whales, recent being in the last 20 years, suggest how North Pacific right whales are using the coast of North America. And that's important information for all of us as voters and as citizens to have when, for a whole number of reasons, right? Places like Swiftsure Bank are extremely important to many whales and many bird species, but are not considered critical habitat by the US. Interestingly, the Swiftsure Bank is considered critical habitat by Canada. North Pacific right whales occur outside of often occur outside of their critical habitat in the Southeast Bering Sea. And at the very least, that critical habitat area should be expanded to account for they're not feeding exclusively within that critical habitat. And then lastly, more research really needs to be done with how North Pacific right whales are interacting with fisheries and interacting with shipping. And to highlight that, I'll leave you with this picture of, this is the North Pacific right whale that Brian Gisborne found on Swiftsure Bank. You can see this part of the whale right there. Oh, that part of the whale is a scar on its rostrum. You're looking at this part of the whale right here. It's a scar very clearly from past entanglement with fishing gear. So this presumably is one of 30 whales left in this population. It has been entangled. If other whales were getting entangled, they could be dying from that. We'd have no idea because of the remoteness of where these whales are. So there's so much we need to know to protect these guys. Their population is so critically endangered that we need to know that stuff yesterday and be putting more conservation actions into place now to save these guys. The film that I'm making with E-Rob and Shaughnessy and Lindsay will highlight this. It's going to be done hopefully in the next couple months. We'll see. You guys will, I'm sure, find out about it through, if you follow Deep Green Wilderness on Instagram, or if you go to our website, you can get on our mailing list and learn more about the film and where you can see it. And I'm going to show you guys, I'm going to take my notes away. I'll say thank you for sitting through my PowerPoint, and much more fun if I get to do this in person. I am going to go stop share. I'm going to go reshare. And I'm going to show you guys, this is Jess Krantz, the acoustics guru, telling us about right whales here.
So the ecosystem in the Bering Sea, it's very dynamic and it's very rich. Right whales probably once played a very important role in the ecosystem. Being a large baleen whale, I'm sure they did have quite a substantial effect. Now with only around 30 individuals or so, their specific effect on the ecosystem is probably pretty negligible. The Bering Sea is extremely productive, and there's quite a bit of zooplankton up there, copepods and euphausids. So it draws in a lot of large whale species, not just right whales, but humpbacks and fin whales and gray whales, minke whales. So it's a very highly productive area, and it's very seasonally dynamic because in the winter, ice will come and cover a large majority of the Bering Sea. So that system is constantly changing every year, and the amount of ice that fluctuates from year to year will also affect the system. So it's a very dynamic, but a very productive system up there. I have seen probably in the thousands of whales. I'm lucky I get to go out to sea every summer, so we see quite a few when we're out there. As for number of species, I've seen probably around 20 different species of whales or dolphins. And I have seen, I think, 14 or 15 unique North Pacific right whales.
Okay, I'm gonna show you 2 more videos. I'm gonna go a little bit over my talking time, but hopefully, you don't mind. This is Giselle Martin, who lives in Tofino, Vancouver Island, and was an incredible person to get to spend the day with here. Oh, no, that's not, that's the one I just showed you. Filmed so nice, we watched it twice. All right. Stand by. Let's see here. Well, I'm going to show you guys Phil Clapham next. There we go. Okay. Okay, this is Phil Clapham, who wrote a book about right whales.
The North Pacific right whale is actually the largest of the 3 species, and it is by far the most endangered. Right whales were given their name a long, long time ago because the whalers considered them the right whale to kill. And the reasons for that were they were very slow, that made them rather easy to catch. They floated when you killed them, which a lot of whales don't, and for primitive whalers that was a big advantage. And they also yielded a very large quantity of very valuable oil and baleen, the filtration system in the mouth that had many uses prior to the invention of plastic. So right whales were hunted. They were actually, as far as we know, they were probably the first species to be hunted regularly on a commercial basis. In 1835, the first whaling vessel came into the Gulf of Alaska, and there they reported seeing 1 million whales, which was obviously hyperbole, but it meant there were a lot of whales, and they meant right whales. So starting in 1835, the North Pacific right whale was hunted commercially on a pretty large scale, and just 14 years later, by 1849, the population had already been severely depleted, such that many of the whalers then moved on to other prey elsewhere. They were hunted in the Western North Pacific as well, and by 1900, they were effectively commercially extinct. In other words, there just weren't enough to make them worthwhile hunting anymore.
Okay, that was Phil, and I think I will stop it there. I can't seem to find the Giselle one. You're gonna have to wait for the full film to see Giselle. Let's see here. I can go. Yeah, so with that, let's see if we can get, there was Katie. Awesome. Hi, Katie.
Right. Great. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. That's fascinating. Yeah, it's something I had never heard about either. So now we know, and thank you so much for that information. If you have a question, I know some of you have put it in the question and answer. I see there's a few coming in right now, so feel free to put your question in there and we'll go ahead and get started with that part of the presentation. All right, Kevin, you ready?
Totally, yeah.
All right. So this is from Lauren Klein. Do we know the ecological impacts of right whale scarcity and what those impacts would be in the event of their extinction?
That's a good question, Lauren Klein. Lauren Klein, who gives the meanest binocular use lesson to middle school kids I've ever seen. Hi, Lauren. You never think that you have to teach kids how to use binoculars, but if you do, they get way better at birding way quicker. The ecological impacts or implications of not having right whales in the North Pacific, there's so few right now that likely they're not the ecosystem engineers that historically there would have been. But so let's say there's 300 now, and the historic pre-commercial whaling estimate is about 30,000. And you can imagine how much, how many copepods and what massive copepods that these guys were turning into nutrients at that time. And there's some cool research about like carbon sequestration and then nutrient cycling from big whales. And of course, every population of large whale worldwide has been decimated. There's, I couldn't tell you the number off the top of my head, but let's say there's 10 or 20% now of what there was large whales worldwide. And so collectively, large whales would have been extremely impactful in the ecosystem, likely with carbon sequestration, nutrient cycling. I'd like to think that that there is some niche that the right whales would be missing from. The fact is there's so few of them that they're likely already missing. I think that losing them from the planet, there's like a moral niche or there's some like moral reason to save them as well. Knowing Lauren, I'm sure he agrees with me there, but there's been some, if people are interested in that, like carbon sequestration and nutrient cycling, if you Google that for whales, there was a bunch of like articles that came out maybe a year ago that were like, news articles about some research that had just been published. I encourage you to Google it. It's cool stuff.
Awesome. All right. So from Caroline Arman, the researcher Brian that you talked about towards the beginning, what's that last name? Do you have it off the top of your head?
His last name's Gisborne.
Gisborne. Okay.
And Brian is like total character in like the best ways, and we obviously sat down and got to interview him, and he knows that he spent so much time offshore. And like what funny interaction I had with him that sort of highlights how much he knows is there's a book on basking sharks that came out like out of 10-15 years ago. If any of you guys have seen that, it's super cool. And I was like, oh, Brian, have you ever read that book on basking sharks? And he's like, yeah, I wrote that book, Kevin. So he's just like a wealth of knowledge of the coast and its history and its natural history.
Okay, and this is another one from Caroline. My understanding is the common name of right whale is referring to that they float when they're dead or they're killed, while most cetacean species sink, and they were near coastal areas, so easier for hunting. Is that correct?
Yes, very, very much. So this is like an unfortunate case of what's in the name. Like right whales were named that because they were in fact the right whale to kill if you were going to go hunt whales. Because like Carolyn mentioned, they floated, they have so much blubber that they float. And if you imagine yourself pre-industrial revolution dealing with, let's say, an 80-ton animal that you've just killed, 5 miles out to sea, the fact that it floats is extremely useful. That, along with the fact that like the blubber yield and the baleen yield, the two products that they were most targeted for, are like pretty insane, bang for your buck. That tons of baleen, tons of blubber. And they were coastal. The first right whales to be targeted commercially were actually out of Spain and France and Europe. And they were very coastal there. And yeah, so they were the first whales that humans had these interactions with, that at least European humans had these interactions with.
Great. Okay, so this is from Janet Alderton. Is there critical habitat in the Bering Sea being affected by climate change?
Yes, yeah, very much so. So Jess mentions it a little bit in that short film piece that we showed, but the part of the Bering Sea that gets covered with sea ice, especially that part of the Southeast Bering Sea where their critical habitat is relatively shallow. Like the whole time we were sailing, the water never got over 250 feet deep or something like that. It's very shallow. And the ice over that shallow water makes this really, really extreme thermocline. So like a layer in the water where you have two different temperatures of water meeting. And the copepods stack up on that thermocline. And it means that they get extremely concentrated, and it makes it easy for the right whales to feed. So basically, if you have sea ice, it's easier for the right whales to feed the next summer. That part of the Bering Sea hasn't frozen in the last decade. There's been a handful of years that hasn't frozen over. Historically, it always froze over. In the last 2 years, it hasn't frozen over. So climate change is another huge consideration for this population. It's especially, I think, a reason to consider expanding their critical habitat, because in those non-ice years, of which we're going to have more of moving forward due to climate change, the whales have to go further, and they go outside of that critical habitat to feed.
All right. So another one from Janet. Have scientists considered satellite tracking, or is the experience with tagging of southern resident orca whale ruled out? Did that rule out trying this?
So great question. They have satellite tagged them. My understanding is that it's safer with right whales. They have that technology a little more dialed in, and that has, I think, something to do with just the thickness of the blubber layer on the whales. The researchers that have done this have met with frustration in that they've gotten some great data of the satellite tagged whale staying in the exact same place for a month straight. Or I forget what the longest tag deployment is that they've had, but it's been pretty long, and they've just watched the whale basically parked in the critical habitat, presumably feeding. And so the argument about its safety, I think, is super relevant and one that should be revisited every time. And I don't have a strong stance one way or the other, because I think there's a good argument to either side. But when they have satellite tagged them, it's been funny that they have yet to get one migrating. And the researchers that will really express their frustration when you ask them about this. They think it's funny that they stay in the same place, but they're also like, just to find one to tag is like a 2-year effort, right? And then they finally get a tag in one, and then they don't get the data that they're hoping to get from it.
Gotcha. And how about, has anyone done any DNA sampling on them?
Yes, so they will biopsy them at times. Which is not easily done in the Bering Sea. I believe one of the BC ones they got biopsied. I know one of the BC ones was female, I believe. And then the ones in the Bering Sea, from time to time, they do. And, that, of course, gives you some genetics stuff, tells you the sex of the whale, and, can tell you some other things about the whale. But interesting is that a lot of those whales alive, so right whales can likely live 100 years or longer. Their closest relative, bowhead whales, are the longest lived mammal in the world. They can live over 200 years. So these individual whales that they're encountering in the Bering Sea, if you're a researcher, when you go out now, one of those whales you run into was very likely targeted by commercial whaling at some point in its life, which is mind-blowing to me that these individual whales have experienced the breadth of humans interaction with whales. We've gone from like being, as my friend Jackie Hildering says, we've gone from being whalers to whale watchers, right? And these individuals have lived through that whole experience. But what that means is when you encounter them in your research vessel, they go away. They don't just hang out they're scared by motor vessels, rightfully so, right? And so when they try to get close enough to these whales to biopsy them, they often have a very hard time doing that. The long answer, yeah.
That's good. Okay, so from Katie Weinstein, will you keep going out to look?
Yes, we are going to finish the film without another expedition, but we will. I love being at sea. I love going voyaging with my friends. We have nothing on the calendar, Katie, but hope to get out there again as the world allows. Katie, you're invited to come too. Both Katies actually.
Okay, I was gonna say, really? Okay, good. Good. Okay, from Gene Sleeper, where can we send photographs of Pacific right whales should we get one?
Oh man, I don't have the email off the top of my head, but it's something like North Pacific right whale at NOAA.gov or something like that. If you Google it, I'm sure you can find it. And if you email me, I will gladly share it with you. Those go to Jess Krantz basically, and then her and her colleagues and Dana Wright and so forth, and compare those into the catalog. So like when those whales were seen off Southern California that you saw in the graphic, pictures of those whales went to Jess, and I don't know if it was through that email, but that is where you do it. Yeah.
Okay, from Jack Sanders, does Japan hunt the right whale does Japan hunt the right whale? We said or Alaska, but I guess does Japan hunt right whales? I'm assuming is what that means.
Yeah, so they don't, right? So like lots of politics and history involved in that, but Japan is, pulled out of the International Whaling Commission, is no longer doing their like a research minke whale hunt, is whaling off the coast of Japan. They don't target right whales. Interesting, and I don't know a ton about the politics of whaling in Japan. I presume that they would not choose in the future to hunt right whales as well. What's interesting is that I do know some about is that the same vessel that Japan uses to go whaling with gets chartered by the International Whaling Commission every summer to do whale surveys. And so they've seen right whales from that vessel, but thankfully they're not out there hunting, they're out there doing survey work. And there's lots of interesting arguments about using a whaling boat to do whale research, especially when I just described whales, so they're afraid of whaling boats. But two interesting things to consider is these guys are expert at like finding whales and driving up on whales. And so if you want to get bang for your buck, these guys are good at it. And two, the fact that Japan is out there doing non-invasive research, the vessel's being chartered for that, but that non-invasive research is happening from that boat, shoots a lot of holes in the argument that they need to kill whales to do research, which has been for a long time their argument with the International Whaling Commission. So it's like a total aside to whale conservation, but it's an interesting aside, I think.
And he did clarify that question again. So how about the tribes in Alaska?
Oh yeah, so no, right whales are not included in there. So there's a lot of native communities that get bowhead whales every year, and it's as they have for thousands and thousands of years. Bowhead populations are doing much better than right whale populations, and right whales, as far as I know, are not included in that. And there is a little bit of overlap of right whale habitat with bowhead habitat, but usually not at the same time. And so right whales as this ice melts, right whales swim north every year. And as the ice melts, bowhead whales swim north. And so the bowhead whales are almost always north of where the right whales are. And certainly when both populations were like at their historic abundance, they were probably interacting on the fringes of that. And historically, those populations of whalers in Alaska would have taken right whales likely in the Aleutians. There were folks there. There was a whaling culture there as well that I didn't mention. I know less about. But currently in contemporary whaling efforts up there don't take right whales.
Okay, this one's from Phil Green. And Phil says, Kevin, how do we get to join you?
Ooh, Phil is so, I bet most of you guys know Phil, and who is like the best naturalist I ever know. So Phil, just send me an email. You're coming, man. I would love that.
Good. Okay. So from Cher Renke, also, have any young calves been seen in the Eastern Pacific population? And if DNA has been sampled, how close are they genetically related?
Yeah, so no young calves have been seen. Juveniles have been seen. And so you know that by their size, basically. And there was one that was seen in 2017, I think. Jess Krantz in 2017 found, it was either 2017, 2018, super recently, found like a dozen right whales in the Southeast Bering Sea. And one of those was this juvenile that they named Phoenix as for like hopeful reasons. But no like young calves have been seen. But presumably that juvenile was a young calf 10 years ago. These guys have a breeding cycle of like 7 years, we think. And so even with 30 whales, let's say, there's a male bias in that population of 30 whales, we think. So there's like maybe 10 females, of those 7 are breeding, they're breeding every 7 years. You'd have to be pretty lucky even to see one of those calves, of course, but presumably they're out there, which is, I hope they're out there. And what was the second part was the genetic relationship. So inbreeding, of course, in a population that size is a huge problem. Interestingly, the North Pacific right whales are less closely related to each other, we think, than the North Atlantic population is, and there's more of them. And then, of course, the eastern population and western population of North Pacific right whales aren't super closely related, are related, but not super close, the genetics show.
Okay, Jack Sanders, can they be federally protected by the US or is that out of their control?
Oh, they are federally protected by the US. And so North Pacific right whales were recognized as their own species. And just in 2015, they got split from North Atlantic right whales. So super recent. I might have that year wrong, but very recently. And with that came actually, it was before that because in 2015, I think is when the recovery plan came out. And so when they're listed as endangered, that means the federal government has to create, legally mandated to create a recovery plan, which gives you the bullet point steps of how you can go about saving that species. And in that estimate includes like funding and where that funding would go and what the cost of saving the species would be. We have that for the North Pacific right whale. People like Phil and Jess contributed greatly to the creation of that recovery plan. And it's currently not being funded, and nothing is happening with it. It's sitting. And so that's another reason why we're really happy to make the film, and why I'm happy to talk to you all is like as a film team, we feel super strongly that the audience has a really simple and actionable takeaway after they see the film. And what that actionable takeaway will be is a campaign that just says, NOAA, fund the recovery plan. And if they don't, it's very likely this whale's gonna go extinct. Even if they do, it's, there's a very good chance this whale's gonna go extinct. But letting them go extinct while the recovery plan sits on the shelf, I think is a corrupt way to look at it. I don't think that's right. And as a matter of fact, it's illegal. We're supposed to, the law says you have to fund it.
Great. And you just answered Jenny McCullough's question too, which was, what do you want people to walk away and do? So that's great. Okay. So do you have contact with Lindblad National Geographic Expeditions? They're doing, obviously not this year, but several expeditions to the Bering Sea out of Dutch Harbor and up to Wrangell. If not, I will try to network a contact for you. So if you want that person, I can.
Yeah.
Okay, that's Jean Sleeper. So I will connect you to Jean.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, Kevin@deepgreenwilderness.com. That would be awesome. Yeah, at the very least, it'd be cool if they had some information on board about right whales.
Okay, great. All right. And then Whitley Mike, what sustainable practices or behaviors can everyday people do to help protect the North Pacific right whales?
That's a good question. You know, with a lot of like sort of nuanced answers, of course. And, you know, I mentioned that climate change, it's extreme effect on these guys' habitat. You know, climate change is happening in the Arctic at much greater rate than it's happening here, including the Bering Sea. And, you know, I would argue that like the best things we can do right now are to advocate for climate change action. There's an election coming up that, you know, it seems like a little bit of like a cop out to just say vote, but if you have an administration in place that prioritizes conservation and puts funding into these, you know, endangered whales, any other conservation thing, that does more than if I, you know, recycle my styrofoam cup or something, which obviously does something and is very worth doing. I'm not saying don't do those things, but like the administration can write a check for $2 million a year that's going to go to research and figuring out how to have crab pots out that don't have a line that goes to the surface. You know, you know, voting people into office that say this area is never going to get drilled for oil. You know, the Bering Sea, Obama took part of the Bering Sea out of oil drilling, which means that you know, conservation efforts don't have to go to stopping oil drilling in that part of the Bering Sea where the right whales occur. They can go to other things, which is, you know, Katie and Lovel can tell you that like these conservation organizations are working with very limited resources to do these huge things. And so having an administration federally and statewide as well that like want to be partners with those things is huge. You know, other things you can do are obviously, you know, pay attention to where your seafood comes from. And, you know, that's the same for all whales and marine mammals and fisheries is, you know, I don't know a lot about, because no one does, about North Pacific right whale interactions with fisheries in the Bering Sea or off the West Coast. But like, at the very least, have the information about where your fish and seafood is coming from, because that stuff's harvested out of the wild and wild animals are having interactions with it.
Great. And I'm assuming a North Pacific, says, has one ever been found dead washed ashore? So we know that the eastern ones have, but what about here?
Yeah, no, so you know, we know a lot about those North Atlantic right whales because like I said, when they die, they wash ashore. And it gets publicized, you know, that even the Seattle Times in the last few years has written articles about North Atlantic right whales. Great, but no, none have been found stranded in recent times, at least. You know, when any marine mammal dies and washes ashore, it gets necropsy, and you try and figure out how it died. Like that picture I showed you of the whale that had been hit by the ship, it's pretty clear with that, right? There's a big propeller marks all down its back. But you know, the coast where these guys are occurring is so remote that even if they did wash ashore, it likely wouldn't find it.
Okay, and this is from Jesse Lorch. It says, what did this whale species evolve from and what are they closely related to?
Oh, cool. Hi, Jesse. Jesse's my cousin. So right whales evolved from, like, obviously all three species of right whale are closely related. They all evolved from a common ancestor that looked like a right whale. And their next closest relative is the bowhead whale. And one of the like commonalities in these guys is that, so I'll show you Pisces again. You'll notice that, and I think it got mentioned at some point, but they have no dorsal fin, right? So orcas, fin whales, everybody's got dorsal fin, except for bowhead whales and right whales. And two other whales, maybe another whale, but the two other whales I can think of are narwhals and belugas. And what all those whales have in common is they live where there's sea ice. And now so having a dorsal fin in a place where there's sea ice is, for some reason, evolutionarily disadvantageous, it would appear. Now, but interesting is that right whales no longer live where there's ice. They migrate south as the ice comes in, but they did clearly evolve where there was ice and they were dealing with it, or from their ancestors were.
And this is from Jack Sanders. How long does it take a calf to reach adult size?
Ooh, good question. I don't know. Yeah, good question. Years, long time. 20,
right. Yeah, all right, so let's see here. There's some also over in the chat, and I just want to make sure we got to everybody. Someone said they heard the whale sound that you played, so that's good. All right, and a few people asked this. Rita, is it Pimpanen and Jack Sanders both said, how can donors help? What could they donate to? Yeah.
Well, we are, I would be remiss if I didn't say that we're actively raising funds to finish our film. It's not cheap. Obviously, Expedition to Bering Sea is not cheap. And deepgreenwilderness.com has a link that you can donate to us, and our like education operations are shut down right now. So money we take in right now is really helping us finish this film. That's what the majority of our efforts going to. And then I would also be remiss if I didn't say fund the Friends of the San Juan Islands, and they're doing great work to prevent ship and animal interaction, and certainly ship and whale interaction. And you look at the charts, and you look at you hear Lovel talk, and it seems like the future, but like this stuff is happening right now, and like it is a serious threat to orcas, a serious threat to right whales, a serious threat to humpbacks, and it's a reality. And they're it's bad to increase shipping, and it's already a problem. And Friends of San Juan Islands is like the premier group fighting this stuff from the US side especially. And so either of these orgs, great way to get the word out there and make change.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, so how about from Right Whales Rule? You know that person? That's a good one. Any embarrassing or favorite stories from your shoots?
Oh, plenty. Lots of embarrassing moments, of course. Some favorite moments. I just can't say enough about how fun it is to be out there with my friends and to get to see these new places. And I'm trying to think of like great story. There's many. It's one of the coolest things about being out there. It's just I spend a few months every year sailing the Salish Sea, 120 days a year, and I love it here, and I get to see all sorts of cool things. But when you go offshore, the ecosystem totally changes. As soon as you hit Swiftsure Bank, it starts to change. You get out past Swiftsure Bank, and it totally changes. And we coming around Vancouver Island, it was it's kind of the same as when you go over the north part of Vancouver Island, the ecosystem all of a sudden gets pelagic and oceanic, and you're seeing albatross and stuff. And it was our first day out there, and there's a shark dorsal fin. We saw a big shark, a big oceanic white-tipped shark, which was kind of mind-blowing to see. And it was just oh yeah, we're someplace different right now. And you get to see these different things, and it's cool, really cool.
Okay, well, I think this will probably be the last one, but another one from Jax. Do the North Pacific right whale males travel alone, and are they a threat to calves?
No and no. So now we don't know much about this for North Pacific right whales, but for other right whale species, they like their breeding behavior is super interesting and very social. And as far as I know, not really a threat to calves, other than there's like, they call it a surface active group, where many right whales are like being quite social and physical, and which is usually, there's a lot of males involved in that. And so I don't know much about it, like a calf interaction with that, but presumably they're not like, you know, targeting calves or anything like that. But these sorts of things have not been seen for North Pacific right whales. And so we say that this is the thing, that, you know, this is the way it is for North Pacific right whales, but it's just an assumption based on data from the other two species.
Okay, great. Well, Kevin, thank you so much. And, you know, those of you that are, you know, on our friends email list, you know, follow us on Facebook and Instagram too. We'll keep you posted when Kevin's film comes out, or definitely I would recommend, you know, connecting with you and your organization via those channels as well. And I copied the chat, just so you know, there are a lot of, it was a great presentation. People are really enthused about right whales and all that stuff too. So I'll show you that later, Kevin, but it was a great talk. And I think we all are, yeah, it's great to know more about all this and how we can help. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Katie and Lovel and Jess. It was great to hang out with you all, hang out. And anyone, feel free to email me. It's kevin@deepgreenwilderness.com. And then you can, of course, access the film there. And rightwhalefilm.com is the film's website. And then I'll do just a quick plug for The Unknown Sea, the other film I've made with Jess, who you introduced me, is up for free at deepgreenwilderness.com. So next time you have a spare half hour and want to learn more about the Salish Sea, you can watch The Unknown Sea there for free.
Great.
Thank you all so much. Yeah, I love it. It's great.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll sign off now. And again, it was good to see all your names pop up tonight. We're all still part of this community, and hopefully we'll see each other in person sooner than later. Right. Good night.
Thank you.